Good evening, everyone. Before we get comfortable tonight, go ahead and get settled in, pull up a blanket, dim the lights, maybe put on that little fan you like for the background hum. And if you're the type who enjoys a good, slow journey through history before drifting off, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, but only if tonight's story earns it. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight, and what time it is where you are. I always love picturing the different corners of the world where this little candle of a channel gets to keep someone company. Tonight we're going somewhere warm, salty and dangerous. We're going to the high seas, during a stretch of about 30 years that historians now call the Golden Age of Piracy. And we're going to ask a question that sounds simple at first, but gets stranger the longer you sit with it. Why did so many ordinary sailors, men who had spent years following orders, obeying captains and surviving brutal shipboard discipline, suddenly turn around and become some of the most feared, reckless, and frankly, unhinged men in maritime history? Because here's the thing nobody tells you about pirates. They weren't born wild. Almost every single one of them started out as something else entirely. A merchant sailor, a navy man, a fisherman's son, ordinary, obedient, exhausted. And then, somewhere along the way, something in them broke, or maybe something in them finally got free, depending on how you look at it. Tonight we're going to trace that transformation from the very beginning, back before the black flags, back before the legends, back to a time when the ocean was simply where poor men went to survive. So settle in. Let's ease into it together. To understand how a man becomes a pirate, you first have to understand how a man becomes a sailor, because almost nobody grew up dreaming of a life at sea in the way we might romanticize it today. In the late 1600s and early 1700s, life along the docks of London, Bristol, or the port towns of the American colonies was not exactly overflowing with opportunity. If you were a poor young man with no land, no trade, and no prospects, the sea was often your only door out of poverty. It wasn't a calling, it was a last resort dressed up as an adventure. Boys as young as 12 or 13 sometimes found themselves aboard merchant vessels, doing back-breaking labour for wages that could generously be described as insulting. A sailor's pay was often withheld for months at a time. Food aboard ship ranged from bland to genuinely dangerous, with weevil-infested biscuits and water that had gone green in the barrel being fairly standard fare on a long voyage. Disease spread easily in the cramped, damp quarters below deck. Scurvy crept up slowly and cruelly, loosening teeth and reopening old wounds. And discipline, especially aboard naval or merchant vessels, was enforced with a kind of brutality that would shock most people today. The lash was common. Officers held near total power over the men beneath them, and a captain with a cruel streak could make a 2-year voyage feel like a lifetime sentence. Imagine spending months at sea under a man who could flog you for a moment of insolence, feed you spoiled meat, and pocket your wages when you finally reached port. Now imagine that happening again and again, voyage after voyage, year after year. For thousands of sailors, that wasn't a hypothetical. That was simply what work looked like. And yet, despite all of this, most sailors did not become pirates. Most endured. Most went home, married, aged, and told stories about the sea to grandchildren who would never fully understand what those years had cost them. So what made the difference? What tipped some men from grim endurance into open rebellion? The answer, more often than not, was a moment. A single decision point where the misery finally outweighed the fear. And there was no better moment for that decision to arrive than during wartime, because wartime is where our story really begins. In the early 1700s, Europe had just come out of a long and exhausting conflict known as the War of Spanish Succession. For over a decade, European navies had needed every sailor they could get their hands on. Privateering, essentially government-sanctioned piracy against enemy shipping, had been booming. Thousands of sailors had been recruited, trained, and put to work raiding enemy vessels under a legal license from their home country. It was dangerous work, but it came with structure, pay, and a kind of patriotic justification. Then, in 1713, the war ended, and with peace came a very unwelcome surprise for tens of thousands of sailors. Navies didn't need nearly as many men anymore. Privateering commissions dried up overnight. Suddenly, a massive population of trained, battle-hardened, heavily experienced seafaring men found themselves unemployed, adrift, and with very few options. Picture it from their point of view. You've spent years learning to sail, fight, navigate, and survive in brutal conditions. You've risked your life for a king or a company that barely acknowledged your existence. And now, with the war over, you're tossed back onto the docks with no pension, no severance, and precious few merchant ships willing to pay a decent wage when there was suddenly a surplus of desperate men competing for every open position. Wages for ordinary sailors collapsed. Conditions aboard the ships that were still hiring grew worse, since captains knew they could treat men poorly and still find replacements. It was, in almost every sense, the perfect economic storm for turning honest men toward dishonest work. When legal opportunity dries up and desperation rises, history has shown us again and again that some number of people will eventually look toward the illegal alternative, especially when that alternative promises not just survival, but revenge against the very system that failed them. And that's really the seed of it. Piracy, at its origin, wasn't just about greed. It was about a very specific kind of resentment, a bitterness built from years of being underpaid, overworked, and treated as disposable by captains, companies, and crowns that never seemed to notice or care. This resentment found its most fertile ground in a particular corner of the world, the Caribbean, and specifically a stretch of low, sandy islands and hidden coves known as the Bahamas, centered around a town that would soon become infamous: Nassau. Before it became a pirate stronghold, Nassau was a fairly unremarkable colonial outpost, loosely governed and often ignored by the British Crown, which had far bigger concerns elsewhere. That lack of oversight was exactly what made it so appealing. There was no strong governor to enforce order, no proper garrison to keep men in line, just a warm harbour, plenty of hiding places among the reefs and quays, and a growing population of unemployed, angry sailors with nowhere else to go. By around 1715, word had begun to spread through the maritime underworld that Nassau was becoming something new. Not just a hideout, but almost a society of its own. Men who had once served under strict naval discipline started drifting there in growing numbers, some still nursing injuries and grudges from the war, others simply following the rumour that money and freedom could be found among the reefs. And it just so happened that history handed this growing population of desperate men an extraordinary stroke of luck, or at least what must have felt like luck at the time. In the summer of 1715, a Spanish treasure fleet, loaded with silver and gold from the mines of the New World, was struck by a massive hurricane off the coast of Florida. Ships were torn apart, cargo spilled across the seafloor in shallow water, close enough to shore that opportunistic sailors, smugglers and adventurers rushed to the area, hoping to recover Spanish treasure before official salvage crews could secure it. This event, now remembered as the wreck of the 1715 treasure fleet, drew hundreds of men to the Florida coast, all chasing the same dream of instant wealth. Some found real fortune diving for silver coins in the shallows. Many more found only frustration, danger, and Spanish patrol ships eager to defend what remained of their sunken cargo. But what the treasure wrecks truly did was pull together a critical mass of restless, ambitious, and lightly employed men in one place, at one time, all of them hungry for a shortcut to wealth they had been denied through honest labour. From these wrecked ships and desperate salvage crews, a new criminal culture began to crystallize in Nassau, and it needed leaders. It needed men bold enough, charismatic enough, and ruthless enough to organize this chaos into something resembling an operation. And it was here, in this strange, lawless harbour town, that some of history's most notorious pirates would rise to power, transforming from disgruntled sailors into legends whose names would echo for the next 300 years. One of the very first names to rise from this chaos was Benjamin Hornigold. Unlike the caricature of a pirate captain that pop culture has given us, Hornigold was, by most accounts, a relatively measured and calculating man, at least compared to what would come after him. He had served as a privateer during the war, and once peace arrived and his income vanished, simply pivoted his skills toward piracy. He began raiding smaller vessels off the Bahamas, careful at first to target only foreign ships, avoiding British vessels out of some lingering, almost old-fashioned sense of loyalty. That restraint wouldn't last among his successors, but it's a fascinating detail nonetheless. Even among criminals, old habits and old loyalties can take time to fully unravel. Hornigold quickly attracted a crew, and Nassau quickly attracted more captains like him. Within a couple of years, the harbour was hosting a rotating population of hundreds of pirates, forming something that later historians would half-jokingly, half-seriously call the Republic of Pirates. It wasn't a nation in any formal sense, but it did develop its own strange, unofficial rules, its own hierarchy of respect based on reputation and success, and its own understanding of who was in charge, even without a single central government. It was within this environment, this strange, floating society built on desperation, resentment and opportunity, that piracy stopped being a scattered, occasional crime and became something closer to a movement. Sailors who had once felt powerless under naval discipline now found themselves, for the first time in their lives, holding real influence over their own fate. And for many of them, that taste of power and autonomy proved to be intoxicating in a way that would shape everything that came next. Because here's something that often gets lost in the swashbuckling myths. Life aboard a pirate ship, in many ways, offered something these men had never experienced before, a version of democracy. This wasn't universal, and it wasn't perfect, but many pirate crews during this era actually voted on major decisions. They elected their captains, and just as importantly, they could vote to remove a captain who failed them or abused his position. Plunder was often divided according to agreed-upon shares, documented in written codes that crews would sign before setting sail. Injured pirates were sometimes promised a kind of compensation, an early crude form of disability payment for wounds suffered in battle. Losing an eye, a hand or a leg often came with a predetermined payout from the ship's plunder. Compare that to life aboard a naval or merchant vessel, where a captain's word was law, punishment could be arbitrary and brutal, and an injured sailor might simply be discarded once he could no longer work. Suddenly, the outlaw life didn't look quite so irrational. For many of these men, piracy wasn't a descent into madness. It was, in a strange and troubling way, an upgrade in fairness, even while it was also a descent into extraordinary violence and moral compromise. And that contradiction is really at the heart of tonight's story. These men weren't simply monsters. They were product of a system that had squeezed them for years and then discarded them the moment it no longer needed them. And when that system finally let go, some of them didn't just drift back into obscurity. Some of them turned around and built a new world for themselves, one flag, one ship, and one act of open rebellion at a time. But rebellion, once it starts, has a way of escalating. And nowhere is that escalation more vivid than in the story of the man who would become the most infamous pirate in history, a man whose very name still conjures fear 3 centuries later. Edward Teach, better known to the world as Blackbeard. Blackbeard's early life remains frustratingly mysterious to historians, a blank page that has been filled in countless times by legend and speculation. What we do know with reasonable confidence is that he likely began his career, much like so many others, as a sailor during the War of Spanish Succession, probably serving as a privateer out of Jamaica. When the war ended and privateering commissions dried up, he found his way, like so many others, toward Nassau and the crew of Benjamin Hornigold. For a while, Teach served under Hornigold as a subordinate, learning the trade, building a reputation, and slowly gathering the kind of respect among fellow pirates that would eventually let him command his own ship. And when he finally did break out on his own, he didn't just become a pirate, he became a performance. Blackbeard understood something that many of his contemporaries hadn't fully grasped. Fear itself could be a weapon, and reputation could do half the fighting before a single shot was ever fired. He cultivated an image so deliberately terrifying that it borders on theatrical genius, even by modern standards. He grew his black beard long and wild, twisting it into braids and tying them off with small ribbons. Before battle, he reportedly wove slow-burning fuses into his hair and beard, lighting them so that smoke curled up around his face, giving him the appearance of a demon risen straight from the depths of the ocean. Imagine being a merchant sailor, unarmed and terrified, watching a ship approach flying a black flag, and seeing, emerging from the smoke on deck, a towering man wreathed in his own personal cloud of fire and shadow. Most crews didn't even attempt to fight. They surrendered before Blackbeard's ship had even come close enough for combat, because the legend alone was often more effective than violence itself. And this is where we start to see the psychological machinery of piracy at its most fascinating. Blackbeard rarely needed to kill anyone. His entire strategy relied on his reputation being so overwhelming that resistance seemed pointless. Historical records suggest that despite his fearsome image, Blackbeard's actual body count was relatively low compared to what popular imagination assumes. His real weapon wasn't his sword. It was the story that travelled ahead of him from port to port, growing larger and more terrifying with every retelling, until eventually the myth of Blackbeard became more powerful than the man himself. But here's where the story takes a darker, more human turn. Because building and maintaining a myth like that comes at a cost. To remain the most feared man on the high seas, Blackbeard had to keep escalating. Every raid needed to reinforce the legend. Every encounter had to add to his reputation rather than diminish it. And that pressure, that need to be constantly, theatrically terrifying, started shaping decisions that went beyond simple piracy into something closer to obsession. In 1717, Blackbeard captured a French slave ship called La Concorde and transformed it into his flagship, renaming it Queen Anne's Revenge and outfitting it with as many as 40 cannons, an enormous amount of firepower for a pirate vessel of that era. With this ship, he became not just a raider of merchant vessels, but something closer to a small naval power unto himself, capable of blockading entire ports. And that's exactly what he did. In the spring of 1718, Blackbeard sailed into the harbour of Charleston, South Carolina, and effectively held the entire town hostage. He blockaded the port, seized ships attempting to enter or leave, and took several prominent citizens hostage, demanding not gold, curiously enough, but medical supplies. Some historians believe this request suggests Blackbeard's crew may have been suffering from disease, possibly even syphilis, and needed medicine that only a proper colonial port could provide. The town, terrified and with no naval force capable of challenging him, complied. Blackbeard got his medical chest, released his hostages and sailed away, having brought an entire American port city to its knees without firing a single shot in anger. It's a remarkable moment in history, and also a deeply revealing one, because it shows us something important about what piracy had become by this point. It wasn't just theft anymore. It was leverage. It was power. A man who, just a few years earlier, might have been an anonymous sailor being flogged on the deck of a merchant ship for some minor infraction, was now capable of holding an entire city hostage and dictating terms. That kind of power, especially for a man who had spent years being powerless, can do strange things to a person's judgment. And it's around this point in Blackbeard's career that we start to see decisions that look less like calculated strategy and more like a man testing the absolute limits of what he could get away with, almost as if some part of him needed to keep proving over and over that the old rules no longer applied to him. Not long after the Charleston blockade, Blackbeard did something that has puzzled historians for centuries. He deliberately ran his own flagship aground near Beaufort Inlet in North Carolina, wrecking the Queen Anne's Revenge along with several other vessels in his fleet. The most widely accepted theory is that this wasn't an accident at all, but a deliberate act of betrayal. By this point, Blackbeard commanded a large crew, and dividing plunder among hundreds of men meant relatively small shares for everyone, including the captain. By wrecking the ships, historians believe, Blackbeard was able to strand a large portion of his crew, reducing his obligations and allowing him to sail away with a smaller, more loyal group and a disproportionately large share of the accumulated treasure. If true, this wasn't the act of a man driven purely by bloodlust or madness. It was the act of a calculating, almost ruthlessly rational businessman who happened to be operating entirely outside the law. And that's an important distinction as we continue through tonight's story, because piracy wasn't simply chaos for chaos's sake. Underneath the smoke, the legend, and the theatrical fear, there was often a cold, very human logic at work: survival, profit, and the accumulation of power by men who had been denied all three for most of their lives. Blackbeard would go on to accept a royal pardon later in 1718, one of several amnesty offers extended by the British Crown in an attempt to end the piracy crisis in the Caribbean and along the American coast. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the most feared pirate in the world might simply retire, settle down in North Carolina, and live out his days in relative peace. Some historians believe he even tried, at least for a little while. But old habits, old networks, and old temptations proved difficult to resist. Within months, Blackbeard was back at sea, back to raiding, and back to drawing the attention of colonial authorities who had grown thoroughly exhausted with his continued defiance. And that defiance would ultimately lead to his final confrontation, a battle that would end not with negotiation or ransom, but with blood, and would cement Blackbeard's legend for the next 3 centuries. We'll get to that final battle very soon, along with the stories of several other pirates whose lives followed strikingly similar arcs of desperation, rebellion, brief and glittering power, and often violent ends. But before we continue forward, let's pause here for a moment and sit with what we've learned so far, because I think it's genuinely important. These men were not born villains. They were not natural-born monsters twirling moustaches for the simple joy of cruelty. They were, for the most part, ordinary working men, shaped by an economic and military system that used them, underpaid them, injured them, and discarded them the moment peace arrived and their usefulness expired. Piracy, for many of them, wasn't the beginning of their moral collapse. It was, in a strange and uncomfortable way, closer to being their breaking point, the moment when years of accumulated resentment finally curdled into open rebellion against a world that had never once shown them mercy. That doesn't excuse the violence, the theft, or the very real suffering that pirates inflicted on innocent sailors and coastal communities throughout this era. But it does help explain something that pure caricature never quite manages to capture: why so many men, from so many different backgrounds, all seem to arrive at the same desperate, defiant choice within the span of just a few short years. It wasn't randomness. It was a pattern, born from a very specific set of historical pressures. And once you understand those pressures, the so-called Golden Age of Piracy stops looking like an outbreak of collective madness and starts looking like something far more human and, honestly, far more tragic. In part 2 of tonight's journey, we're going to follow this story further into the darkness. We'll meet Calico Jack Rackham and the 2 women who fought alongside him, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, whose stories challenge nearly everything we think we know about who pirates actually were. We'll examine the extraordinary and often overlooked pirate codes that governed shipboard life, rules that in some ways were more progressive than the legal systems back on land. We'll follow Blackbeard to his final brutal battle at Ocracoke Inlet, and we'll trace how, eventually, the British Empire mustered the will and the resources to bring this entire era crashing down, hunting pirates across the Caribbean until the Golden Age finally and violently came to an end. So stay with me, get comfortable if you're not already, and when you're ready, let's sail onward into the second half of tonight's story. Let's pick up right where we left off, out on the water, somewhere between rebellion and ruin, because there's still a great deal of this story left to tell. If Blackbeard represented the terrifying theatrical face of piracy, our next figure represents something almost the opposite. A man whose fame came not from being the most feared pirate on the seas, but from the company he kept. His name was John Rackham, though history remembers him by a nickname that has far outlived any of his actual accomplishments. Calico Jack, so named for the brightly coloured calico cotton clothing he apparently favoured, in an era when most pirates dressed in whatever dark, practical fabric they could scavenge. Rackham first appears in the historical record as a quartermaster serving under a captain named Charles Vane, one of the more ruthless and uncompromising figures operating out of Nassau. Quartermaster was, in many ways, one of the most important roles aboard a pirate ship, arguably rivaling the captain in terms of actual influence over the crew's daily life. While the captain typically held authority during combat, the quartermaster often managed the distribution of plunder, settled disputes among crew members, and served as a kind of check on the captain's power, elected by the crew and answerable to them. This detail matters more than it might seem at first glance, because it reveals something crucial about pirate governance that popular imagination often overlooks entirely. Many pirate ships operated under surprisingly formal written agreements, often called articles, which crew members would sign before a voyage began. These articles laid out rules for behaviour, specified how plunder would be divided, established compensation for injuries sustained in battle, and even outlined punishments for various offences, from theft among crewmates to cowardice in battle. Some ships forbade gambling aboard, having learned through hard experience that disputes over cards or dice could quickly turn violent in the cramped confines of a ship. Many articles specified that lit candles or open flames near the ship's gunpowder stores were strictly forbidden, a rule motivated by simple, practical survival rather than any lofty moral principle. And in a detail that consistently surprises modern audiences, several surviving pirate codes included provisions for compensating men who lost limbs or suffered serious injuries in combat, essentially an early and informal form of disability insurance, centuries before any government would consider offering something similar to its own soldiers and sailors. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes the entire narrative in an important way. These weren't simply bands of chaotic criminals operating on pure impulse. In many cases, they were remarkably organized communities, governed by consent, however imperfect, rather than by the top-down authority that defined nearly every other institution these men had ever served under. For sailors who had spent years being flogged, cheated out of wages, and treated as expendable by naval and merchant captains alike, this new system, dangerous and illegal as it was, must have felt like an almost radical form of justice. Back to Rackham. After a mutiny against his captain, Charles Vane, whom the crew judged to be too cautious and unwilling to engage in a promising raid, Rackham was elected as the new captain, a fitting example of exactly the kind of accountability we just discussed. Crews didn't simply follow orders blindly. When a captain failed to deliver results or seemed to be putting the crew's interests behind his own caution, that captain could be removed by vote and replaced. It's a striking contrast to the rigid, unquestionable hierarchy of naval command that so many of these men had fled in the first place. Rackham accepted a royal pardon at one point, much like Blackbeard, and much like Blackbeard, he found the pull of piracy difficult to resist for long. He returned to the sea, and it was during this period that his story took an unusual and genuinely remarkable turn, one that continues to fascinate historians and popular audiences alike centuries later. Among Rackham's crew were two women, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Their presence alone was extraordinary for the era. Women were rare enough aboard any ship, let alone a pirate vessel, and the fact that two women managed to serve, fight, and earn the respect of a pirate crew speaks to just how differently pirate society sometimes operated compared to the rigid social expectations of life on land. Anne Bonny's early life was marked by scandal even before she ever set foot on a ship. Born in Ireland, the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer and his family's servant, she was raised for a time in disguise, dressed as a boy to help her father avoid social embarrassment, before eventually emigrating with her family to the American colonies. As a young woman in Nassau, she became involved with Rackham, defying her family's wishes and eventually joining him at sea, reportedly disguising herself as a man to participate more fully in shipboard life and combat. Mary Read's story follows an even more remarkable path. Born in England, she too spent much of her childhood disguised as a boy, a deception her mother apparently orchestrated for financial reasons related to an inheritance. Read grew comfortable with this disguise and carried it into adulthood, serving for a time as a soldier in a military regiment, then aboard a merchant ship, before eventually falling into piracy, quite possibly captured and absorbed into a pirate crew during a raid, as happened to many sailors who found themselves suddenly presented with a choice between joining their captors or facing far grimmer consequences. Both women ended up serving under Rackham, and by most surviving accounts, both fought with a ferocity that matched or exceeded many of their male crewmates. Contemporary testimony from their eventual trial describes them as being among the most aggressive and fearless fighters aboard the ship, cursing, brandishing weapons and pressing the attack even as many of their male crewmates, reportedly drunk and disorganized, hesitated during their final, fateful battle. That battle came in October of 1720, when a colonial sloop commissioned specifically to hunt down Rackham's crew caught up with his ship near Jamaica. According to surviving accounts, most of Rackham's male crew were too intoxicated or too disorganized to mount an effective defense, retreating below decks as the attacking vessel closed in. Bonny and Read, however, reportedly stood their ground on deck, fighting fiercely and, according to some retellings, even shouting insults up through the hatch at their own crewmates for their cowardice. The battle was lost regardless. Rackham and his surviving crew were captured and put on trial. Rackham himself was executed by hanging shortly afterward. Bonny and Read, however, both claimed to be pregnant at the time of their trial, a legal circumstance that, under the customs of the era, delayed their execution. Read reportedly died in prison of a fever before her sentence could be carried out. Bonny's ultimate fate remains one of history's more tantalizing mysteries. There is no clear historical record of her execution, and some historians believe her family may have paid for her release, allowing her to quietly disappear from the historical record entirely, perhaps living out the remainder of her life in relative anonymity, an oddly peaceful ending for a woman whose youth had been anything but. Their story matters for tonight's exploration because it reminds us that piracy, for all its brutality, occasionally offered a kind of escape valve that simply didn't exist elsewhere in early 18th century society. For two women constrained by the rigid expectations of their era, disguised as men just to survive in many of the roles they occupied, a pirate ship, chaotic and dangerous as it was, apparently offered something closer to genuine autonomy than anything available to them on land. Now, let's return to Blackbeard, because we left him at a pivotal moment, having accepted a royal pardon before drifting back into piracy, drawing the increasingly frustrated attention of colonial authorities who had grown weary of his continued defiance. By late 1718, the governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, had decided he'd had enough. Blackbeard's continued presence along the Carolina coast, even after accepting a pardon, represented an ongoing threat to trade and colonial stability that Spotswood was determined to eliminate, regardless of jurisdictional technicalities. He organized a naval expedition, led by a young lieutenant named Robert Maynard, and sent him to hunt Blackbeard down. Maynard located Blackbeard's ship anchored near Ocracoke Inlet in North Carolina in November of 1718. What followed has become one of the most legendary confrontations in pirate history, retold and embellished so many times over the centuries that separating fact from myth has become genuinely difficult. But the core details, as best historians can reconstruct them, paint a picture of extraordinary violence. Maynard's initial approach was nearly disastrous. Blackbeard's crew unleashed a devastating broadside as the naval vessels closed in, killing or wounding a significant portion of Maynard's men before hand-to-hand combat even began. But Maynard, in a moment of tactical cunning, had ordered most of his surviving crew to hide below deck, making his ship appear far more damaged and undermanned than it actually was. When Blackbeard's men boarded, believing they faced only a handful of survivors, Maynard's hidden crew emerged, and a brutal, close-quarters battle erupted across the deck. Blackbeard himself, according to surviving accounts, fought with extraordinary ferocity, even as he sustained wound after wound. Contemporary reports describe him being shot multiple times and slashed with swords repeatedly, continuing to fight even as his body absorbed damage that would have incapacitated most men many times over. He was finally killed, reportedly by a combination of gunshot and sword wounds, and in a gesture meant to serve as an unmistakable warning to any pirates who might consider following his example, Maynard ordered Blackbeard's severed head hung from the bowsprit of his ship for the return voyage. It's a brutal, almost operatic ending, and in many ways it fits the theatrical legend Blackbeard had spent years carefully cultivating. The man who had built his entire reputation on terrifying spectacle met an end that was, in its own gruesome way, equally spectacular. And his death sent an unmistakable message throughout the pirate community scattered across the Caribbean and the American coast. The era of relatively unchallenged piracy was drawing to a close. Because Blackbeard's death wasn't an isolated event, it was part of a much larger, coordinated effort by the British Empire to finally bring the Golden Age of Piracy to an end, an effort that had been slowly gathering momentum for several years and would accelerate dramatically in the years following his death. For a long time, piracy had flourished partly because pursuing it simply wasn't a high priority for colonial and naval authorities, who were often stretched thin across vast territories with limited resources. But as piracy's economic toll grew, disrupting trade routes, terrorizing merchant shipping, and increasingly threatening the profitability of colonial enterprises that formed the backbone of the British economic system, patience in London finally began to run out. The British government dispatched additional naval resources to the Caribbean and along the American coast. They appointed more aggressive colonial governors, empowered to pursue pirates with real resources rather than simply issuing occasional, ineffective pardons. And perhaps most importantly, they began treating captured pirates with severe, highly publicized punishment, designed not simply to remove individual threats, but to fundamentally reshape the calculation that had drawn so many desperate sailors toward piracy in the first place. Mass trials became a common tool in this campaign. In one particularly notable case in 1722, a British naval officer named Challoner Ogle captured a massive pirate fleet commanded by a captain named Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful pirates of the era, who had been killed during the battle. The resulting trial saw dozens of captured pirates tried simultaneously, with a significant number sentenced to execution, their bodies displayed publicly as a deterrent to anyone who might consider following the same path. This shift in approach mattered enormously, because it fundamentally changed the risk calculation for sailors who might otherwise have drifted toward piracy out of the same desperation that had driven the original wave of pirates just a few years earlier. Piracy had once offered a genuine, if dangerous, alternative to grinding poverty and abusive treatment within the legitimate maritime economy. But as the British response grew more organised, more resourced, and more brutally decisive, that calculation began to shift. The potential reward of piracy remained tempting, but the potential cost, capture, public trial, and execution grew increasingly likely and increasingly severe. At the same time, broader economic conditions were shifting in ways that reduced the pool of desperate, unemployed sailors who had fueled piracy's initial explosion. As European economies gradually recovered from the aftermath of the War of Spanish Succession, merchant shipping expanded, creating more legitimate employment opportunities. Naval forces, having initially demobilized after the war, eventually found new uses and new conflicts that required experienced sailors, further absorbing some of the surplus labor that had once flooded toward piracy out of pure necessity. By the mid-1720s, the golden age of piracy that had burned so brightly and so briefly was effectively over. Most of the era's most notorious captains, Blackbeard, Rackham, Bartholomew Roberts, and countless others whose names have faded from popular memory, even if their stories were equally dramatic, were dead, captured, or had quietly retired from the trade before their luck finally ran out. Nassau, once the beating heart of this strange, lawless pirate republic, was reclaimed and properly garrisoned by British colonial authorities, its brief experiment in outlaw governance brought to a definitive close. So what do we make of all this, looking back across the distance of 3 centuries? I think the golden age of piracy offers us something more valuable than simple entertainment, more valuable even than the swashbuckling adventure stories that Hollywood has spent the better part of a century spinning from these events. It offers us a genuinely fascinating case study in what happens when a large population of desperate, mistreated people suddenly finds itself with an opportunity, however dangerous and illegal, to seize a measure of control over their own lives that had always been denied to them through legitimate means. These men weren't monsters from birth. They were, for the most part, ordinary sailors, shaped and hardened by years of exploitation within a maritime economic system that offered them poverty, brutality, and disposability in exchange for their labor and, quite often, their lives. When that system briefly weakened its grip, in the chaotic aftermath of a major war, with thousands of trained, armed, and thoroughly embittered men suddenly cut loose with no legitimate prospects, a significant number of them made a very human, if deeply troubling, choice. They decided that if the world wasn't going to offer them fairness, they would carve out their own version of it, however violent, however illegal, and however brief that version ultimately proved to be. And there's something almost tragic in how quickly it all came apart. Most of these men didn't get to grow old. They didn't get to see whether their strange, self-governed pirate communities might have evolved into something more lasting had circumstances been different. Instead, their story burned brightly for less than a decade and a half before the full weight of imperial power came crashing down, ending the experiment in blood, public executions, and severed heads mounted on bowsprits as warnings to anyone who might dream of following the same path. Yet here we are, 300 years later, still telling their stories, still fascinated by their audacity, their brief taste of freedom, and the strange, uncomfortable humanity hiding beneath all that legend and theatrical terror. Perhaps that's the real reason these stories continue to capture our imagination, generation after generation. Not because these men were simply villains or simply heroes, but because they were something far more complicated and far more human than either label allows. Ordinary people, pushed to extraordinary extremes, who chose, however briefly and however violently, to write their own rules in a world that had never once bothered asking what they wanted. And on that thought, I think it's time to let this story rest for tonight. The tide is going back out. The candles in Nassau's harbour have long since burned down to nothing, and somewhere out past the reef, 3 centuries of legend continue to drift quietly along on the tide, waiting, as they always do, for someone new to come along and tell them once again. Sleep well tonight, everyone. Wherever you're tuning in from, know that no black flag is coming for you before breakfast. If you enjoyed tonight's journey across the water, I'd love for you to stick around. Subscribe if this kind of story is the sort of company you enjoy at the end of a long day, and let me know down in the comments which historical journey you'd like to take together next time. Until then, rest easy, and I'll see you on the next voyage.